So, hi, Tim. You must be a happy person in those days because history is basically happening every day. How do you work as a historian in that sense? How can history help us to go into a better future?
So first of all, Boris, it's really good to see you, and I'm really glad to have a chance to talk to you. That's a big question about history, and I'm really happy to have it because it's such a nice question, it's such a valorizing question. I mean, from the point of view of a practicing historian, that's not how life feels. Life doesn't really feel like people are paying a lot of attention to the humanities or people are paying a lot of attention to historians. I mean, on the contrary, I think one of the ironies of this moment, the early 21st century, is that history is so palpably necessary to explain what's going on, and yet at the same time, it's generally dismissed. And even if you are, as I'm fortunate enough to be, a historian who's employed, who has some kind of status, who has some kind of voice, you're constantly dealing with the refrain of, well, wait, can you really make a comparison, or can you really make that analogy, or whatever it might be? And all of those reflexes are basically ways that people have of not thinking about the past, of claiming that the present moment is exceptional, that nothing like it has ever happened before. And the problem with that kind of thinking is that it then enables everything. It disempowers everyone, because if everything is always new and different, that just means that whoever happens to have the power now can do what they want without any argument, without any reason, without anyone taking time to think. And so to answer your question in the most basic way, what historians do is they say, no, this is not entirely new. Nothing's entirely new. Everything has some resemblance to something else, and everything comes out of something else. And if we take a deep breath and think about some of the plausible resemblances, and take a deep breath and think about some of the continuities, then we see what we don't see, to answer your question. Then this present moment, which was presented to us as shocking and new and demanding an immediate response, and the immediate response of the person who has the power, then the moment starts to look different. And from that moment, when it starts to look different, then you start to get traction, and then you can start to act. So that's how history can help.
But how does this play into kind of a collective discourse in a democracy that people have a chance to learn? How do we make sure that for the functioning of a democracy in our times, this knowledge is part of the public debate?
Yeah, I think this in a way is like that's the revelation of the 21st century. That you have to make a value commitment to factuality, right? I mean, in the late 20th century, people who consider themselves to be supporters of democracy or supporters of human rights would very often take the position, well, we don't have to be sure about what the truth is. There really isn't any truth. In fact, part of our very individual subjectivity, the thing we're protecting, is that we all have a different perception of the world. So who's to say what truth is? But it turns out that position is actually fundamentally disempowering. Because if there's no truth to strive for, you have your views and I have my views, and if everybody has their own views, all that's left at the end of the day is money and power, is the ability to make a spectacle, to convince people very quickly and to move on through the rubble to the next thing that you want to do. So in order to empower people, you have to say, well, there actually is a real world, and that real world is the place where you can stand up to other people, where you can stand up to institutions, you can stand up to governments. You can't stand up to the government. You can't stand up to corporations. You can't stand up to power in a fake world. You just can't do it. It can't be done. And so there has to be a value commitment, and then there also has to be an institution. We have to say, look, factuality doesn't arrive naturally, and this is a revelation of the 21st century too. We would like to think that the free market, normal human exchange will make the facts rise to the top. But it doesn't. That just isn't true. I mean, there's a long tradition in liberal thinking which says, hey, let's just have a free exchange, the truth will always win. It doesn't. We have to say, look, if you want truth, you have to create it. You have to manufacture it. The important truths are the things that are happening every day that, going back to your first question, we don't see. The pollution or the inequality or, the new pandemic which doesn't get covered by the newspapers in America because there are no newspapers to cover it. These are the things that you have to have facts for, and those facts have to be produced. They're not just there. And that means you have to have producers. You have to have local journalists, people who actually are paid to do this job. And, in Russia and then in my country, that job basically disappears. And when that job disappears, what you lose is the facts, and then you lose the faith in facts, and then you find yourself in this weird, quasi-authoritarian situation where anything goes. So I think, there has to be a moral commitment to factuality on the left, on the right, in the center, and we have to do what it takes to support institutions, especially local journalists, which keep producing facts day after day after day after day.
In times where kind of big techs feed their business case, the dependency on democracy on these big techs who feed the business case is kind of the driving force. Getting Trump out of Twitter, right, was a shocking moment because it shows the dependency you have as running a democracy, being dependent on the fact that there's these different channels which give you the access to the people, and all the other accesses are not there anymore. Where do we go here?
Yeah, so going back to your very first question about what history is good for things like this. History is good to think about new media. New media are always shocking. The printing press cost Europe about a third of its population, right, in religious wars. Before you got the printing press sorted out into the idea of a book with copyright and verifiability. The radio was used by the Nazis, right? They saw it as a great opportunity to get the same message across to every household. And so the same goes for the internet. We shouldn't think, we're rational people and therefore there's this high tech and we're going to use it rationally. Nothing in history suggests that. Everything in history suggests that whenever there's a new medium that's powerful, people use it to do crazy things for a really long time. And that's where we are with the internet. The internet is like this new drug which we've only had for half an hour and we're still experimenting with it. And so what history says is, we don't really have 150 years this time. We can't go through 150 years of religious wars. We can't afford that. We have to get our minds around this in the next few years. And what history also says is that media end up having regimes around them. They end up having rules, right? And so all this talk, the happy talk around the internet that you can just not regulate it, that like the laws of the market and freedom and so on, that's just not true. Any new medium will eventually have its own rules, and the question is, what rules do we want to have? So with Twitter and Facebook and Trump and so on, I don't have any problem with Twitter and Facebook, giving Trump access on Thursday or giving him access, on Wednesday, or not giving him access at all, because I don't think there's a moral question there. The moral question is not that. The moral question is, why do so few media have so much power? Because, the real question is it's not our access to information, it's their access to us. The things that we see, whether we see a Trump tweet or not, depends on what the companies think they know about us. And that's what worries me, is that is that rather than being the people who are seeking the truth, we are becoming the objects of constant searching ourselves, right? And so my view is that the issue isn't whether Trump's on Twitter or not. It's a relief that he's not, of course. But the issue is that these companies have so much central power over what we end up seeing or not seeing.
We saw what happened on the 6th of January in the United States and the riot on the Capitol. If we understood that after the Second World War, there was this kind of alliance of the West for democracy and human rights, and the European Union coming in as a player which, had its limitations in being in having this aura of a force fighting for the values, I think lots of this credibility is gone, basically. Do you see it the same way, or do you still see that this Western alliance is still there?
I don't see it so darkly, and I'll tell you why. First of all, at a very simple tactical level, I think this is an opportunity for the European Union and an opportunity for European capitals, including Vienna. The Americans need you. The Biden administration needs you. They have a lot of other things on their mind. It would be a good time for Europeans to come up with initiatives, big initiatives, small initiatives, tiny initiatives, which don't cost anything but have symbolic value. I mean, the kinds of things which went from the United States to Europe in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. Just a little bit of that coming back in the other direction right now, a tiny bit of that would be a good thing. Now, that's just tactics. But in terms of history, look, some of the credibility the United States had, it didn't really deserve. And I don't think it's particularly a bad thing for the United States to now have to reconsider its own history and build forward. And that's what this is all about. I mean, for me, the underlying question in all this is, what do you do when a certain kind of empire basically fails? What do you do after that? And that's what 6th January is all about. I mean, 6th January is all about people who believe that they have a certain kind of claim of superiority to other people, which is more important than votes, which is more important than democracy, and they're going to assert that claim with violence. And that's natural. You know, when you have a frontier empire, when you conquer native populations and exterminate them, when you have a history of slavery, you will also naturally have a current in your country which says certain kinds of people, because of the color of their skin or because of how they interpret the past, have a right to control. So when those men are standing in the Capitol, in our parliament, and saying, "Whose house, our house?" That's what they're saying. They're saying that this belongs to us, regardless of the voting. It belongs to people like us. And so you have to face that. I mean, and this is why, going again back to your first question, which is so important, this is why history is so important. Because if you don't have history, you can't say, well, wait a minute, the Confederacy in the United States really wasn't such a good thing. Wait a minute, if we have a long history of excluding people from voting, where does that really come from? Wait a minute. When you say that there's voting fraud, aren't you really saying just that black people shouldn't vote? And is that really what you mean? And of course, some people, it really is what they mean. They really do want to exclude other people from voting. They really do want authoritarianism. But without history, you simply can't have that conversation. Without history, it's just about how some people feel that they're the real Americans and that they therefore have endless rights. And the same thing is true for the European Union. I mean, as you know, this is what I talked about when you were kind enough to invite me to speak a couple of years ago, that the European Union can only move into the future if it has a serious look at its own past. I mean, right now it has an unserious look, which is that we're a bunch of nation states, we learned from the Second World War, and now we're going to move forward. But that's not really what happened. I mean, just like the US, the major European powers were empires. And the European Union is the answer to the question, what do you do after empire? That's the same question the US is facing now. I mean, Joe Biden will never stand up and say it, of course. It's too grand and it's too abstract, but that's the question in the US. Can you, after having been a kind of country which builds a frontier empire and enslaves and destroys, can you then treat everyone as a citizen? And I think you can. I mean, this is why I don't see it so darkly. I think that's possible, but I only think it's possible if we're, again, going back to your other important questions, if we're serious about facts and if we're serious about history, and if part of being a citizen or educating citizens is to inculcate those values of historical thinking and factuality.
One thing is clear, I think, and many people also have this opinion saying the European Union won't move until they accept that they are also something like a hard power, right? They establish methods and instruments of being a hard power. The other thing, I think, is the strange relation between the European Union and Russia, which also limits the fact that Europe really can be globally and politically active beyond its borders, right? How can Europe get its act together, considering those circumstances which make it rather complex in order to have this voice or to be this force, which could kind of, where the Americans, could have a player they need, as you said, but also somebody who is able to act at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the ability to act is really important. And I think you can take relatively modest steps, which would have significant consequences in creating an ability to act. I mean, if you look, just to look at this from the other point of view, if you look at the Americans in the last couple of years, we've had a terrible time with the coronavirus. It looks, although of course we don't know everything, but it looks like we had a second terrible defeat in another cyber war with Russia last year. And in both of those cases, you could ask, well, what did our $700 billion of defense spending get us? And in both cases, the answer is absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. I mean, the greatest threats, arguably, to life in the 21st century, this pandemic, and then cyber, we can spend almost the better part of $1 trillion a year, and we did nothing to stop them, right? And so, just because we have the biggest military budget doesn't necessarily mean that we're using force in the right way. And so when I look at the Europeans, I look at your armed forces, what you see is a kind of post-imperial legacy that the French and the British have armed forces because of the kinds of powers they used to be. Germany, as it were, doesn't have armed forces because of the kind of power that it used to be. The question is, what kind of force would Europe need? And I'm just going to repeat the thing I've been saying now for 20 years. I think Europe ought to have one division. I think you ought to have one division that you can actually put on the battlefield somewhere, which is a European division. And that just that one division would change the strategic calculus entirely when it came to places like Ukraine. Because now you're thrown back into the position that whenever anything happens, no matter how small, if it's military, your immediate response is to say, whoa, well, it's military, therefore let's transform it into economics. We'll make it an economic question. And before you know it, then you have Germans talking about how there has to be Nord Stream, and suddenly like the aggressor in the war is being rewarded. So I think it's actually morally problematic for Europe not to have that one division, because it means that the other side is always defining in a way the moral way that a conflict gets understood. If somebody else uses military force, you're forced back into talking about economics, or you're forced back into talking about discourse. So I think you should have one division that can actually fight. And I think you should have a European military academy, which, an institution, a small institution, which trains actual European officers who then have some kind of European esprit de corps, which maybe is a building block for something later on, maybe not, but an officer academy and one division. And I think you would be in a different and better place.
Part of the European countries were happy about Trumpism. Part of the European countries look at Putin in some way, drive some semi-authoritarian regimes at home, as we all know it, right? And the European Union has also become a bit incredible, lost credibility there too, because these are all countries of the European Union. It is so hard to explain to a country in the Southern Balkans, listen, if you want to become a member, you have to accept our values, when inside the European Union you have states which don't accept those basic values the European Union was built on. So how do you see this development going on?
I think here you have an opportunity for a discussion between some of the European capitals and the new American administration, because the new American administration, insofar as it has a foreign policy concept, its foreign policy concept is democracy. So, and in some measure, Hungary, Poland have been taking cover behind the Trump administration. That's not the only thing which has been going on, but in particular, the connection between the Hungarian government and the American government under Trump was quite intimate, with, I think, the Trump people actually doing the learning rather than the teaching in that connection. I think there's a conversation to be had now between some of the European capitals and the Americans about this, about how you do democratize. I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a shame that the European Union only has incentives, democratization incentives, when you're trying to join it. But once you're in it, you can kind of do whatever you want. And there's some very intelligent politicians like Mr. Orban who figured out just how far you can take this logic. So I don't have an easy answer for that, because I mean, in my view, the politics of the European Union is more important than the economics, but that's not how the European Union is set up now. I think it's actually an existential question for the European Union. I think you're right to be concerned about it, because the European Union has a kind of power around the world because of the way it's seen. And that's true in the United States. It's true in Belarus or Ukraine. It's true in Russia. And you don't try to have that power, you just do have that power. It's just there. But the more, if you have more than, let's say you get up to 3 authoritarian regimes in the European Union, I think you then lose that power. Even here, I'm not without hope. I mean, if we're talking about Russia and Belarus, one of the interesting things about Russia and Belarus is that these are so obviously domestic movements.
Yeah.
I mean, the irony is that that the Russians spent years explaining how any form of any kind of democratic opposition in the post-Soviet space is the result of American interference, and then they have a president, Trump, who agrees with them and says, "Yeah, it was all a plot by us. People don't like democracy. We won't be doing anything now. I, Trump, actually quite like you, Putin. I think your regime is great." And precisely at that moment, you then have these tremendous pro-democracy movements in Belarus and Russia, right? Which just shows that these things aren't all machinations by America or the European Union. I mean, our reputation matters more than our direct actions, far more. But also something more fundamental, which is that people actually like democracy. I mean, we're right to bemoan developments in the U.S. We're right to bemoan developments in Hungary and Poland. But on the other side of the balance, there's Slovakia, and there's Belarus, and there's Russia. There are places where you can see that despite the spread of authoritarianism these last 15 years, actually democracy appeals to people. People want to be represented, and that's a good reminder, because I feel like part of the problem with the European Union and with the Americans is that we've all gotten a little bit cynical about democracy. We've kind of stopped believing in ourselves, and so it's good to have refreshing voices, from beyond, to remind us, actually, this is something that you make sacrifices for. This is not something that you take for granted.
One final question, Tim. We're going through this pandemic now. One thing we experienced is the dependency of our, pharmaceutical industry on Chinese products is a disaster. So what will stay out of the 2 years now, second year of pandemic experience we're in?
I mean, so now you're doing the tough thing of asking historians what's gonna happen,
Sorry.
So I will 75% dodge that. I will say this: pandemics are hugely important in history. I mean, without the Black Death, probably there's no Renaissance, for example, and no age of exploration. So it's hard to say just how a pandemic is going to affect history, but they clearly affect history, as opposed to memory, right? You can say people don't remember the Spanish flu, and that's true, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have historical significance, right? I mean, all those people who died, their absence changes history in some way, even though we're not good at writing about these things. We're much better. I mean, it's a good example. We're much better at writing about war, because war makes a kind of sense to us. Even the First World War, which made no sense, makes more sense to us than the Spanish flu. And so we write about it, we remember it, but that doesn't mean the Spanish flu doesn't matter. And I think you're right that this too will be a kind of historical point. I mean, a turning point. I think with respect to the EU and the US, it has significance. I mean, I think the EU and the US have both learned in different ways that we were too dependent on other countries. And it may be an opportunity for the EU and the US to ask, well, maybe this would be a sphere where we could cooperate more and be a little bit less dependent on China than we were. I'm being optimistic, but that's a chance. I think more broadly, one of the things I hope we've learned out of this disaster, is how health and freedom are connected. So in my country, at least, like, health is all about the left and freedom is all about the right. But whether you're on the right and you don't like masks and you want to do whatever you want, or whether you're on the left and you believe in the science and you like the masks or whatever, in both cases, you can't help but notice that when you're not healthy, you're not free. And when there's a pandemic, the country is less free than it was before. So, I mean, I wrote a little book about this, but I mean, this is one thing I would like to see, is that we realize that health isn't just some compartment. It's not some technical problem to be solved. It's also about living a life where we get to express ourselves as people, right? And that's always true. It's not just in pandemic times. And I think also this has taught us something about the digital world, which is basically how limited it is. How limited it is. That we don't, I mean, what the pandemic did was it suddenly pushed us forward like 50 years into the future, into one future, let's say, where all we do is what you and I are doing now, right? All we do is Zoom. We don't see other people. We're locked into a kind of nuclear family, and how and when we can schedule and achieve things depends upon the machines, and nobody likes it. Or I shouldn't say nobody. I mean, some people like it, but generally we don't like it. And I think that's a lesson. It's a moment to stop and reflect and say, okay, the tools are good for some things, but we shouldn't be letting the tools decide for us what's actually possible for us as human beings. And so I think that may turn out to have been a useful lesson as well. I mean, I can remember like talking to some acquaintances at the top of some of these big tech firms a year ago at the beginning of the epidemic, and they were happy because they were like, yeah, now everyone's going to see how great digital school is going to be. But I mean, it's not a secret. Like, despite the best efforts of really good people, digital school is not great. Human school is great. There are a lot of things where the human thing is what's actually great, and this may have been a reminder of that as well. So, there's my very general answer.
Tim, thank you for joining this call.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Take care.